Hello, everybody. People keep asking me about starters, and starters are pretty important, so I thought I'd do a quick video of what I do with starters. Starters are kind of the base of your bread. If you screw up your starter and try to use it, you'll probably get bad bread. Or you'll still bake with it, it just may not be the best. So it is important. So, what's in a starter? Well, it's basically yeast and bacteria, mostly bacteria. It's about one cell of yeast for every 100 cells of bacteria. So it's mostly a bacterial culture. Now, what do these microbes do? Well, generally speaking, the yeast produce alcohol and CO2. The bacteria produce lactic and acetic acid. That lactic and acetic acid is what gives sourdough its sour taste. A lot of people get mixed up about what to feed their starter. Well, I'm going to tell you there's no set rule for feeding your starter, what you actually feed it with. I've tried different things, and what I've decided to stay with, which works for me, is 1/3 high protein white flour, 1/3 light rye flour, and 1/3 whole wheat flour. I just found that this mixture really ferments strong, and it gives me a strong flavor profile in the bread when it's baked. But you can use whatever you want, experiment and see what happens. The only thing I would suggest to you is have at least a little bit of whole wheat flour in there somewhere to help with the fermentation and the flavor profile, and definitely use filtered water. Don't use tap water. When should you feed your starter? Well, I do mine when I get up in the morning, and then I do it again right before I go to bed at night. 2 feedings in 24 hours. Sometimes I'll flip to one every 24 hours. I just have to raise the flour ratio to do that because it peaks quicker when at the lower amounts. But whatever works for you, make it fit into your schedule. Just try not to go over 24 hours with each feeding, and you should be okay. What feeding ratio should you use? I mean, there's a lot of this on the internet. 144, 155, 188, 11010. What they're talking about is the grams of starter to grams of feed flour to grams of water that you mix together when you're feeding it. I use a 145. It's simply easy. It's easy, it's simple. I don't measure it out every time. I approximate what it is, and it works just fine. If I was going to go to a 24-hour feeding schedule, then I would do a 188 mixture because there's more flour in there, and it takes the yeast longer to eat all that flour, and it peaks at a later time period. What I do on baking day is I use a 1:1:1 ratio, and I'll explain that in a little bit. When do you actually harvest your starter? Well, you harvest it as close to peak as you can get it. You don't want to go past peak too much, and you don't want to go too early. Generally, most starters peak when they rise about 2 to 3 times above what their feeding level was. So if they double to triple, that's usually around their peak time. Mine peaks at around 2.5. What affects how fast it rises? Well, it's that feeding ratio, as I just stated, how much flour to water to starter is in there. And the temperature is very important. The sweet spot for starters, particularly on baking day or mixing day, is about 75 to 80 degrees. That's what I try to hold to when I'm mixing my dough that day. My mixing schedule, the day I get up to mix dough, it starts at about 6 a.m. and I feed a 1:1:1 ratio into my starter. I know that if I use a 1:1:1 ratio, and if I hold my temperature of my starter between 75 and 80 degrees, I know it's going to peak in about 6 hours. It's very consistent. This is why you need to test your starter at certain ratios and certain temperatures so that you know exactly when it's going to peak. And that's so you know when what your baking schedule is going to be. The last thing you want to do is feed your starter, be ready to mix your dough in 6 hours, but you're still sitting there 10 hours later because it's still rising. If you are going to shoot for that 75 to 80 degree Fahrenheit temperature, use a proofing box. Put your starter in a proofing box, or put it in the oven and turn the light on for 30 minutes and turn it back off. Something that'll give it a little bit of heat. And then measure the temperature of your starter, not the air around it, but the starter itself, so you can maintain that temperature until it peaks. As a conclusion, I will tell you that all starters are a little different. They all behave a little bit differently depending on your kitchen, your biome, what you're doing with it, what you're feeding it. Just be consistent with it. If you're consistent with your starter, the times you feed it, what you feed it, how you feed it, then it will be consistent with you. It'll rise in a specific amount of time. It will give you a very consistent flavor profile to your bread, and it'll be a good starter that you can use for years and years and years. So just be consistent and don't be afraid of it. Anyway, that's all I got for you. There's much more detail I can give you about starters, but it would be a 3-hour video, and I don't want to do that to you. So if you have any questions, reach out, and I'd be happy to answer the questions and tell you what I do with my starter. Everyone have a great day, and happy baking.